Hello, everybody. This is Jade with the Octopus Literary Podcast. I'm starting something new this week. In order to practice my YouTube skills with video editing and talking in front of a camera, I am going to be doing a series on John McCrae's Pact, which is a book that I'm not sure very many people have read, but I really am enjoying, and I've read a lot of his other work, and I really liked that too. So I'm just going to be using this series to talk about stuff that I found interesting in it. It's not going to be terribly structured, and I just want to talk about Pact, guys. So Pact is the second web serial written by John McCrae. John McCrae goes by the internet pseudonym Wildbow. Wildbow wrote the very popular web serial Worm, which is about superheroes, and then immediately afterwards he wrote Pact. Now he's written two other web serials since then called Twig and Ward, Ward being the sequel to Worm. And Pact is generally considered to be not the worst, but it's the least popular by far. Worm was very, very popular, and Ward, being its sequel, has most of the same reader base. And then Twig is also pretty popular, but Pact was not as well received because it's very dark. The ending of Worm was quite dark, and he started writing Pact like a week or less after Worm finished. Wildbow has talked about how he was still in a very dark mindset when he started writing Pact, and that it affected the story and the directions that it went quite a bit. I don't know very much about where the story is going. I have actively avoided spoilers. So this podcast is only going to go over the details of what I've read so far, which is chapters 1.1 through 2.x. In fact, I haven't even finished 2.x. I wanted to do all of arcs 1 and 2 in this video, but I just had so much to say that I figured I might as well stop where I am and just start talking. So the next time I do a video, it'll be on 2.x through... I'm not sure. I am going to talk about Worm and Ward, but I'm not going to spoil anything from those. So if you want absolutely no spoilers about Worm and Ward, don't watch this video. But I will be talking about stuff like character traits that some of the characters have, some of the general details of the premise. If I feel like something would ruin a plot beat, I'm not going to talk about it. So in this first section, we set up the story of Pact. Now, in the other books I've read by this author, the plot of what's going on changes wildly as the story goes on. So what is introduced here, I'm sure, is far from the sum total of what this book is about. But so far, it's about a boy who comes from a large family called the Thorburns. And the boy's name is Blake, and he's, I believe, 20 years old. And the Thorburns own a very, very valuable piece of land in a town called Jacob's Bell. The piece of land has a house on it called Hills Glade House. The land that the house is on is valued at about $20 million because as soon as they leave, the town of Jacob's Bell intends to pave over Hills Glade House and all of the land and turn it into a medium to large suburb, something that the members of the community have been counting on for a long time. So whichever of the children inherits the house may or may not decide to sell the house, and this would be a huge deal to the community because at this point they can't expand until one of the kids sells the house. When Blake enters the story, he and all of his cousins are speaking to their grandmother, who is on her deathbed, about why they should or should not inherit the house and all of the land that goes with it. The grandmother, whom we will call Rose Sr., she told the family that she would give the entire inheritance to one of her granddaughters, and that the inheritance couldn't be split in any way. So this has caused all of the girls in the family to be very conniving towards each other because they have been raised with the idea that they are in competition. And Blake got tired of the bullshit. It says that his parents desperately wanted a girl so that they would have a chance at the inheritance, but they didn't get one. They got Blake. So Blake actually left when he was about 17, was homeless for a little while, and hasn't seen his family since. And it appears that his family hasn't looked for him at all. And it turns out within the first chapter that the reason that no one in the Thorburn family has given up this land is because it's magic. This is the domain of this family of magic users that has been passed down for hundreds of years, probably. And it doesn't matter who inherits the house. They're definitely not selling it. They are going to be one in the next in a long line of witches. And so Blake is not eligible to inherit the house. But when he goes to speak to his grandmother, he yells at her for being for effectively tearing their family apart by pitting the girls against each other. And she decides that she does indeed want Blake to inherit the house, even though he can't, given the spell. So, well, we don't know the details of why it has to be a girl at the moment, but boys can't inherit the house for magic reasons. But Rose Sr. decides that she wants Blake to inherit the house anyway. She gives the house to another one of Blake's cousins, Molly, who is murdered brutally shortly after. And Blake finds out that he is the next in line to inherit the house. The implication being that Rose knew Molly would die. Rose Sr. knew that Molly would die very quickly. On the night of Molly's death, Blake is woken up in the middle of the night by nightmares, and he looks in the mirror and he sees a female version of himself looking back. And it turns out that Rose Sr. has created a reflection of Blake, basically. His reflection has been replaced by a female version of him who is able to converse with him and has had an entire simulated life's worth of memories of exactly what Blake's life would have been like had he been a girl. So she has vastly different experiences than him. She, rather than running away from home, she finished high school and began going to college. Their parents named her Rose, so Rose Jr., but I'm just going to call her Rose because she gets way more screen time. So Rose Jr. tells Blake that Molly has been killed and that he has to get to the house, which is safe ground, as quickly as possible. Blake and Rose are able to make it to the house, and then they are effectively locked in this house for the foreseeable future, as it's the only place that they are safe from a huge volume of people who are trying to kill them. People and creatures. And they find basically a letter from Rose Sr. that describes what they need to do in order to continue to be eligible to own the house. It involves things like mastering magic, breeding 75% of this giant library. They have to set up a magical domain for themselves. They have to pick a familiar. And they have to get married, one of them, and have children, all within 5 years, as well as some other stuff. And if they fail within 5 years, the house will be passed on to somebody else. But the stakes aren't really that they will lose the house. The stakes are they're probably going to die, seeing as Molly died only 4 months after she was given the house. So their challenge is to do better than Molly. So that's the basic premise of Pact. So far, I really, really like it. I could guess by the fact that the other 2 books I've read by him I really enjoyed, that I would enjoy this one too. But the thing is, I haven't read magic in a long time. Sometime after I finished Harry Potter, I thought to myself, I like superheroes and science fiction a lot, and I like fantasy less than I like those things. So I'm just going to read superheroes and science fiction all the time from here on out. And I haven't been back to magic, I think, since I was in middle school. So I don't have a good intuition for how magic in fiction works. And it's also really difficult to impress me with magic. So the fact that I like this is kind of a miracle. But it could partially just be the novelty of it. I really liked the setup of the scene where all of the family members are talking to Rose Sr. about whether they should or shouldn't inherit the fortune in the house. You don't know what is going on, but it becomes very clear without being told, and it's just expert show versus tell. Right from the get-go. You start out confused, but you know from the first chapter of this story that you're going to be confused unless you figure it out, you the reader. But that's exactly what the entirety of this book is about from Blake's perspective. He is going to be confused unless he figures out what he needs to do, because he's the dumbest, and by dumbest I mean he doesn't have any experience magic user in Jacob's Bell by a huge margin. So you the audience, starting out confused and just being dropped into the middle of this was a perfect representation of what the rest of this book is going to be like. I have one complaint for everything that I read so far, but it's right at the beginning. So there is this habit that Wildbow has, or had, that he got over in Ward. Well, by the time he got to Ward, which is introducing like 50 characters at the same time. I don't know how many is the most he's ever introduced, but it could very well be the first chapter of Pact, because there are a minimum of 30 characters introduced in the first chapter of Pact. I don't know how many words the first chapter of Pact is, but it took me 45 minutes to listen to the audiobook, so that's an average of like a minute and 20 seconds per character, which is not enough. Fortunately, everyone that we've met so far, as of 2.4, I believe has been in that first chapter, so no one else has been introduced. But this introducing everybody at the same time thing drives me nuts, because in Worm, I got confused right off the bat as to who people were, so I looked up who they were, and I got spoiled on those characters' endings. The two characters that I looked up at the beginning of Worm when I was in Arc 3 were Alec and Brian. If you've read Worm, you know that those are the two male characters with the most screen time. So right from the beginning, I had 2 out of the 6 main characters' entire plots completely spoiled. So maybe I'm just a little bitter, which is why I didn't like that first chapter, but yeah. That was the only thing I didn't like, though. I really, really like the idea of Rose as Blake's reflection. I don't know where we're going with this yet. Just the idea of your reflection being somebody else is the kind of story idea that you think of being in fairy tales from like several hundred years ago, but you're not gonna read about now because writers usually think that it's silly. I appreciate the fact that Wildbow is willing to take these tropes that most people wouldn't attempt, play them straight, and execute them flawlessly. So Yeah, I love it. Second of all, and even better than that, um, a, 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 a story setup with two protagonists will always be my favorite. Um, where you've got one main character and then like another main character that they're always around and talking to. No matter how long that series is, I am always going to prefer that over any other setup. So I'm really glad that Pact has this, because this is something that you don't always see, especially when it's not a romance. At least I don't think that's where this is going. Pact has two protagonists that basically share a similar level of importance. And then, secondly, I would rank an ensemble cast, which is what Ward has, where everybody pretty much shares a similar level of importance, but there's a bunch of people. And then, dead last, I would rank Worm's setup, which is where you've got one protagonist just kind of running around interacting with a bajillion different people. Even though some of those people are more important than others, I just didn't like that as much. So I'm really glad that Pact is set up the way it is. So on the topic of showing, not telling, which I'll never bring up again because that's the only way that information is conveyed in this series, is the scene right at the beginning where Blake asks his landlord to borrow his car. So after Blake first sees Rose and Rose tells him that Molly is dead, he realizes that he has to make it to Hillsglade House, but he's not going to be able to take his motorcycle there. So he runs downstairs and asks his landlord if he can borrow his car. And his landlord hugs him and gives him his keys. And Blake is in a large apartment building. It tells you right off the bat that Blake is a trustworthy person that other people like, and they want him to succeed and be okay. I just loved that little detail. It could have been his next door neighbor, it could have been his best friend, but no, the person who gives him the keys to their car is his landlord. I thought it was cool. Most of the first arc takes place with Blake and Rose sitting inside Hillsglade House, reading or talking or moving boxes around. I love that part of books. I like the beginning, before everything hits the fan. And the thing is, things have already hit the fan, but I still adored these scenes right at the beginning of the book. The first 7 arcs of Worm, which are generally considered to be the boringest, were what I was most interested in when I first read it. So I really enjoyed the first arc, just because it's quiet. So in the 4th-ish chapter, Laird, the chief of police, approaches Blake and tells him that he wants to talk, basically, outside of the house. And over the course of this conversation, Rose is able to figure out and communicate to Blake that Laird is a magic user, or a practitioner, they're called. The practitioner who deals with time. And so Rose and Blake are trying to figure out how Laird is going to use time to fuck them over. There are 2 ways that Rose and Blake can be targeted, which is if they leave the house or if it's dark. Blake goes with Laird to a coffee shop, and Laird gets up to go speak to the barista, and Blake talks to Rose about how is Laird going to screw with us? You know, how can we get out of this? What do we need to anticipate? And during this conversation, Laird casts a spell or something such that 4 hours pass, and when they leave the coffee shop, it is already dark. And this was awesome, right? Because I was trying to figure out what was going on. And it was obvious, right? But it made me feel dumb. And I love that Wildbow books make me feel a little bit dumb. Because I am using my brain and I should be able to figure these out. And then when I do eventually figure out the system and I'm able to figure out what the characters need to be doing in a certain situation, I feel smart. But the Laird maneuver made me feel like an idiot, and I loved it. So the next bit that I really, really liked was the pizza scene. So the following day, or I don't actually know how long it was, but so Rose and Blake, after getting back to their house after being stranded out in the dark by Laird, which did cause them quite a bit of problems with the local fairies, they realize that they need to be a lot more careful about not going outside. So to test what they can and can't do, Blake orders a pizza. They have no way to get food because they can't leave the house, so they need to know whether they can order stuff. And the whole first half of this chapter is just Blake pacing, trying to figure out whether he has doomed this pizza guy or whatever, and you let your guard down and stuff. And this is the one bit where I'm going to retread ground that Deep in Pact did, because I fucking loved this, right? The faceless woman caught up to him, the pizza guy. Her free hand reached into the back of his head, and I could make out the fingers reaching out the front, moving just beneath the skin, closing it together into a fist over one of his eyes. She moved her hand, leaving the skin bound shut in the knot of flesh, and she closed the other eye in the same manner. Another movement nearer the mouth and throat, and the screams were cut off. Knitting, molding his flesh, almost casually. My concern was no longer that I'd killed the man. My concern was that he might live. "Blake!" Rose's voice from the living room. "You have to help him." I took a step forward, then stopped as the faceless woman continued her work. Her fingers wriggled and crawled across the man's scalp just beneath his skin, burying his hair, reaching down to cover his ears, trapping him in his own skin so his own flesh was a hood over his face. Scenes like this, awesome. We're going from legal trouble to environmental peril by being stuck outside, to body horror within like 3 chapters, just bam, bam, bam. And it makes it, you can never anticipate what you're going to see next. I like this book a lot. And this description is only up to chapter 1.6. The townspeople. So the townspeople hate Blake. He goes later on. He goes out to get groceries, and the townspeople come after him. Specifically, other members of his family, but the townspeople also participate. They come after him and tell him that he needs to give up the house, and if they don't, they're basically going to make his life hell. So one of the things that they do is they make it look like he started a fight in the middle of the grocery store. They block his access to getting groceries. So he now knows that he can't actually get any food, even though the only safe day for him to go outside is once a month. So he's really just screwed. But the thing about the townspeople is I wasn't sure how much I liked this concept at first. And I'm still not sure. I haven't fully decided. But the townspeople kind of come across as a bunch of idiots. So Worm started out as the story of this girl who was being bullied. And the bullying that occurred was so heinously awful that it would have been absolutely unbelievable if it weren't for the fact that we know by living in this world that bullies do unbelievable things occasionally. So the townspeople can come across as unbelievable, right? And you keep thinking, why did these people even buy in this town if there's just the idea that it could be something better later, but this one family's been sitting on this one piece of land for a couple hundred years. It turns out that the townspeople are being magically manipulated by another one of the families, which is a relief because it means that the townspeople aren't just a huge group of numbnuts uniformly. But I'm still not sure how much I like the concept of Jacob's Bell yet. So back on that later. So the last thing I wanted to talk about in the stuff I liked and stuff I didn't section, maybe doesn't even go in this section, but so Worm and Ward, both of their protagonists, are incredibly intelligent badasses who are able to quickly analyze whatever situation they're in and deal with the problem decisively. Both Taylor and Victoria are hyper-competent badasses who never get any real mentoring. Occasionally they do, but largely no. Blake is completely inexperienced, and on top of that, Rose is definitely the brains of the pair. And it results in Blake and Rose needing a lot of help. They keep having to ask for help from people who are their enemies. And by help, I mean like basic advice for what magic is and what it can do. They have to ask Laird, their enemy, who is the chief of police, about the most basic of spells. And one of their lawyers, who is a demon, is the one that actually helps them figure out how they can maybe defend themselves in a very, very dire situation. So I get the feeling that in this book we're going to be working, instead of from the middle to the top, from the bottom to the top. So I'll let you know later how much I like that. So now I'm going to talk about some of the thoughts that I had while I was reading. This maybe should have been done in a different order, but whatever. So Blake and Rose are handled as the two different possibilities of what Blake's life could have been like if he was a boy or if he was a girl. And in the hands of any other author, I would hate this premise. Because the full extent of how each difference in their lives would affect them is explored in a way that makes their differences much deeper than pink is for girls and blue is for boys or whatever. But one of the things that every single Wildbow character has as a differentiating factor is how they handle empathy and what their EQ is like. And I don't just mean like, are they bad or are they good on like a scale between 0 and 100. They have completely different ways of understanding emotion. So Taylor, the protagonist of Worm, is shockingly bad at emotional intelligence, both observing her own thoughts and observing hers. But she, unless she really, really puts her mind to a specific situation. At one point, for example, she says that because her dad didn't kill himself after her mom died, he would probably be okay if she died. Awful. So Sveta from Ward and Brian from Worm are both very good at understanding other people's emotional states so long as they have known that person for a long time. They're able to observe the people they're close to over the course of years and then just completely understand everything about them. And then we have Ashley, who is able to effectively understand how a person is feeling and thinking just by looking at them, but has a very difficult time controlling her own emotions. And then we have Victoria, who isn't particularly emotionally intelligent, but she spent a lot of time around therapists and spent a lot of time reading documentation on how to deal with different situations. So she has a lot of like pre-prepared responses to certain situations, and it makes her quite effective at dealing with other people, provided the situation isn't too dire. So Blake and Rose have similar differences, but because I'm only on chapter 2.4, I can't quite pin down the differences between them yet. I have no doubt that I will, because I finished reading Worm 8 months ago, and I could probably write you a 6-page essay on how each of the characters would deal with any given situation, because Worm is just that long, that we're able to explore those characters to that depth. So I'm sure that I will understand Blake and Rose completely by the end of this, but for now, I'm not quite there. So one of the things that is really frustrating, but frustrating on purpose, like there's nothing wrong with this as a plot point, but it's frustrating, is Blake's consistent non-curiosity about Rose. So the moment Rose was introduced, I was like, now I want to know about every detail of every difference between these two people. And Blake doesn't. So we don't know what Rose is studying in college. She could be studying law, which would be really, really useful in their situation. And that seems to be what she's interested in. She could be studying art, which all of Blake's friends are artists, so he would want to know that. She could be studying math and have no relevant skills. But Blake has never asked, and we know almost nothing about her beyond what Blake needs to know right now, because they're like about to die. And this definitely stems from Blake's own discomfort with his past. He doesn't want to know how his life could have been better if something had been different about his childhood. So this manifests as him like passively treating Rose as somebody that he can't completely be a partner with. He will always, or right now he's always holding her at a distance, despite the fact that he always talks about how he wants to be closer to her. And finally, Rose always asks about Blake's past, but he never asks about hers. Another point, so Blake and Rose are supposed to improve the family's karmic debt, which is the Thorburns have done so much bad shit over the last X hundred years that they are in deep shit karma-wise. That's a really complicated topic. We'll talk about it at a later time. But one of their directives is to improve their family's karmic debt, which normal people would interpret as doing good deeds, but they basically just spend most of their effort lawyering around not making their karmic debt worse. So far they're not even trying on that front. So karmic debt counter so far as of 2.4, they're pretty much flat. Keep you updated. There's this theme across all of Wildbow's books of the protagonist never having any relief. So Taylor started out suffering more than most people suffer in their lives, and everything just always got worse for her from there up until the end. And that was some people's complaint with Worm is that Taylor never blows off any steam pretty much at all. And then Victoria, we see her doing positive things with other people, but they never provide her any relief. There's several chapters where she will like go shopping with Sveta, but it's always about her helping Sveta, not her feeling better because she got to go shopping with her friend. All of the things that you see Victoria doing cause her pain. We know that off screen she has a close friendship with Ashley, and they talk about how they did a fun thing together previously, and we can infer that she achieved some amount of relief from that, but we never see those scenes either, so it just gives the impression of Victoria also always suffering. So Blake, same deal. Every interaction he has with Rose is a promise to try to be better, but we don't usually see things get better. We know that he has a lot of close friends. We don't even know any of their names. We haven't seen them. We know that he's close with his landlord, but that's it. And of course, every experience that Blake has so far has been basically about to actually kill him. So, yeah, that's just a running theme I've noticed in these books. Another thing that is a running theme in Wormwood and Pact is these compounding deals with devils or over-compromise so that progress is never apparent. So in order to accomplish things, Blake has to give something up, and it always makes him feel like he's worse off than he started, even though he is actually getting closer to his goals. So I debated whether to bring this up, but so in Worm and Ward, every time I think, in this situation, a weird sex thing could occur, but no, that wouldn't occur. That's too weird. And then it ends up happening anyway. There's no way that I can describe any of those instances without spoiling. But I will give what I think is an instance now. So we have seen Blake and Rose be uncomfortable being naked around each other twice. And we're not very far into this book at all. Now, I have no illusions that there will be any romantic shit between Blake and female Blake. But I do think there is going to be weird sex shit between Rose and male Rose. Just because every time I've thought I would be wrong about this, I was right. Two naked scenes is a lot. Yeah. Next. Hillsglade House is going to get destroyed. Yeah. So Blake and Rose have this, like, frustrating non-consideration of what Rose is responsible for. So Rose has a lot of... Rose Sr. left Blake and Rose this letter of the things that they need to accomplish by the end of the 5 years. Including getting married and having children. But they assume that all of these things have to be done by only Blake. I don't think this makes any sense. The requirement is, for magical reasons, that a woman has to inherit the house. If the requirement was a vagina has to be in the house, the first order of business would have been for Blake to get married to a woman. But it specifically says Blake needs to get married to a man. Or it says whoever inherits the house has to get married to a man. They never consider, or they do consider the possibility that it could be Rose, but they don't consider it for very long. And I feel like they're walking into something really stupid, really fast. next, so in the Deep in Pact podcast, they talk about around like chapter 2.1, 2.2, people started speculating who Blake would marry, shipping. So I want to put in my 2 cents. And by now you've probably figured out that my 2 cents is at least 5 minutes. So in arc 3 of Worm, Taylor is sparring with one of her teammates, Brian. And I went, oh, I get it. I've read a YA book before. This is our love interest. And I anticipated that the relationship between Brian and Taylor would be similar to that of any other teenage romance in fiction of the last 10 years. So I assumed that Brian had no character traits beyond being male. So as I was paying attention to this, Brian is actually a very well-developed character, and one that I related to quite a bit. So I actually started to give a shit about Brian and his relationship with Taylor. What I did not realize until way later is that Wildbow was not trying to tell a conventional story by any means. He probably gave no consideration to how things are usually done the entire time. And the relationship between Brian and Taylor is full of trauma, heartache, and pain, even while they still remain believably pretty good for each other. I didn't realize that it was possible to still achieve a similar level of relationship pain to Gone Girl without there actually being any abuse. But Wildbow did it. But I forgot all about that when I started reading Ward. Because for the first several arcs of Ward, I assumed that Victoria would not have a love interest at all. But around arc 7, Victoria had a conversation with somebody, and I kind of got a vibe from that conversation. I picked up on some non-platonic subtext between Victoria and this other character. And as Ward went on, I was pretty correct. And the thing is, I like Victoria a lot better than I like Taylor. And I like this other person a lot more than I liked Brian. I also liked the interactions that Victoria had with this person a lot more than I liked the interactions between Taylor and Brian. So I started to give many shits about this relationship. But this is a book by Wildbow. And I forgot that. So recently, that has gone over like a sack of bricks. There's still a little bit of hope there that I cling to desperately, like a moron. But the moral of this whole story is, it is my goal to give 0 shits about the love lives of Blake and Rose. I do not want to care about this marriage bit. If Maggie or Johannes is one or both of Rose and Blake's love interests, I hate them. I do not care about them at all. Am I lying to myself that I'm not going to care about these people? Of course. But I wouldn't wish the fate of a Wildbow protagonist love interest on anyone. So finally, I want to talk about some themes and patterns that Worm, Ward, and Pact share. I'm probably not going to talk about any of these in a future video because these largely deal with stuff that's probably going to stay the same. But I wanted to talk about it. So I want to talk about the fact that Worm and Pact both actually have a really similar setup at the start. I'm not under the illusion these are going to stay the same in any way, but they're both about a social outcast. They're both about somebody that the rest of their community hates for no reason and treats like shit beyond the level of what would normally be believable. Both take place. They're both about a town with different factions, or in this case families, who have different traits. They don't share a lot of details that are the same, but the overarching like setup is pretty similar, and I thought that was kind of neat. There's an overarching theme of family, so Blake becomes the person who inherits his family's land and fortune, and he is pitted against other families in Jacob's Bell. His relationship with Rose is largely, if not completely, colored by his relationship with his family. And in Ward, the situation is quite similar. Ward is largely about the relationship between Victoria and her sister and their family as they deal with the feud between Victoria and Amy. It's something that I noticed immediately as being very similar between the two books, although I have less faith that Blake will be able to salvage his relationship with his parents. Then there's this interesting pattern that is absolutely prevalent between all three of these, which is the idea of children being raised by the village. So for one, it appears that all of the kids in the Thorburn family were pretty much raised in a big old mishmash. There's not a lot of talk of siblings being more similar to each other than to their cousins. It seems like cousins are basically on the level of siblings, and aunts are on the same level as parents for most of these kids. Also, when Blake ran away from home, he considers the people who took him in to be his family. This is something that is definitely recurring in Worm and Ward. So one of the main characters in Ward is an 11-year-old girl named Kenzie, and so far she has 14 parents. She has accumulated 14 parents that I've just thought of now. I forgot about Victoria. 15 parents. And she's just kind of passed between different groups. This is the same for like most of the kids in Worm and Ward, even those that are like 17 years old. Taylor comes from a family with a dad who loves her dearly, and she still gets an extra set of parents in the back half. Victoria comes from a family of superheroes where everybody in the family has powers, so everybody participates in the team. So the kids are raised by the collective team. It's this children being raised by the village thing is really, really pervasive in Wildbow's work, and it makes me wonder about his childhood a lot. Speaking of growing up, there's this idea of whether or not you go to college. Pretty early in Worm, Taylor drops out of high school, and there's a lot of talk of what she's going to do with her future other than be a superhero, which isn't really working out for her. And then Victoria is very interested in going to college, and in the prologue of Ward, she receives a rejection letter from a university asking her to try again next year. So, and then here in Pact, Rose and Blake, one of them is a high school dropout and the other one is a college student. This is only an indicator of other aspects of their lives, but it's imagery that is used quite a bit. All three of these are stories about the protagonist's relationship with an aspect of themselves. So Ward is about the relationship between Victoria and her passenger, the creature that lives in her head. And Pact is obviously about the relationship between, so far it appears to be about the relationship between Rose and Blake, them being each other's reflection. So that's interesting. Then there's this idea of image and how others perceive you. So in Worm, all of the characters are always trying to be very intimidating. They're always very conscious of how they're being perceived by everybody else, so that they can always be the scariest mofos around. And then in Ward, the team is extremely concerned with their costumes in a similar way, but they want to appear invulnerable. They make appearances on television, so they want to look a certain way. They each wear a hologram that makes their costume look better than anybody else's around. So this idea of image was the one thing that, if you'd asked me what would probably carry over into Pact as being something that I think Wildbow would continue to use in his work, I would say the protagonist is probably someone extremely conscious of image. But Blake isn't, like, at all. Which is why I busted out laughing when the lawyer explains to Blake that he has to do everything with flourish and poise, because the fairies and the spirits are watching how he does things to make sure that it's fancy enough. So even if you're not a person concerned with image in a Wildbow story, he's gonna make you be concerned with image. Then you've got this idea of the protagonist's mode of transportation. So Victoria always talks about how, because she can fly, she feels disconnected from the rest of humanity. She doesn't have to sit in traffic. She can fly much faster than any car can get anywhere, so she doesn't have to deal with this aspect of human life. And she definitely has a noticeable disconnect with everything that's going on in the greater city. Taylor, on the other hand, has no such ability, and if she wants to go anywhere, she either has to walk or take the bus, and which is extremely in the weeds of everybody around her. This manifests as Taylor seeing herself and presenting herself as a champion of the people. She's not removed from humanity as Victoria is. She's very much in the dirt with all of the other people who are suffering in Brockton Bay. So Blake rides a motorcycle, and we can glean from this, using similar symbolism, that he values his independence and need to not rely on others, which is a trait that he says that he has, but he also isn't removed from everybody else. He wants to be close to others. It's very hard on him that he has to be separated from the rest of the community when he's living in Hillsglade House. His tattoos represent his connections to other people, not anything that he specifically likes. And he has difficulty coming up with things that are his own character traits, independent of how others have affected him. All three protagonists are tall, organized people. Pure coincidence, I'm sure. Actually, I'm not sure how organized Blake is, but Rose definitely is. We've got a running image in all the books of twins. So there was a body doubles recurring motif in Worm, where there was a lot of clones and stuff. And then in Ward, you've got the twins Tristan and Byron, and then you've got Ashley and her twin. Which is a lot of twins to be main characters. There's a recurring symbolism, there's a recurring motif of simulations. So in Worm and Ward, rather than having people who can literally see the future, you have people who have the ability to perceive the world as a whole and effectively run a simulation of what will happen given certain conditions. And this allows them to basically see the future based on how they can act. And there's at least 5 characters that can do this, who are all very important. And in this case, you've got Rose, who is a simulation of what Blake would have been like under different conditions. Which brings us to the running motif of, what would my life have been like if X happened? In the case of Rose and Blake, it's, what if I had been born with the opposite set of genitalia? In Ward, we have Ashley and her twin sister, who's also Ashley because they aren't twins. They are both clones of someone who died. And the two of them were cloned 3 years ago, and they made a minor decision differently right at the beginning of their lives, even though they have the same memories. And from that point on, their lives kind of butterfly effect rippled out, and they became completely different people. One of them is nice, and the other one is a jerk. One of them is my favorite character, and the other one, I've been waiting for someone to punch her in the face for like 40 chapters. Still hasn't happened. There's not enough talk shit get hit in Ward. You've also got this running theme of, what life forms is it okay to kill, and what is it okay to not kill? The aforementioned Ashley twins actually show up in Worm, but because they're clones, everybody basically agrees that it's okay to kill them. They're just clones. But in Ward, they're both main characters who are treated exactly as any other human being. In Pact, Blake and Rose come across this ghost named June, who is the ghost of a woman who froze to death after she got into a fight with her husband. And Blake figures out that if a man gives her like a hug, it will allow her soul to find peace. But Rose prevents him from doing this because she's just a ghost. She's just an echo of a bad experience, and there's nothing actually suffering. She just looks like she's suffering. Given the flip-flop that we had on clones between Worm and Ward, which basically retroactively proved that the clones in Worm were completely sentient creatures that should not have been killed. I'm pretty sure where we're going with this is that Blake should have given June the hug and given her fragment of a soul peace, rather than use her as a tool, because they imbue her soul into a hatchet so that they can have an icy hatchet. Again, another beat of them not even trying to do the right thing and improve their karmic debt. Instead, they don't do that. Well, no, instead they are trying to stay alive, which they do need to do. So yeah, that's all of my points on the first 10-ish chapters of Pact. I'll be back next week with thoughts on whatever I read. It'll probably be a lot shorter, and I'll just have a lot less to say. But because this is the first arc, I had a lot that I was interested in saying. So, see you at the next one.